story you are about to hear isn't one you'll find in history books, nor whispered in polite company. It is one of those truths buried beneath layers of family silence and small-town denials. A tale that should have never been unearthed. Yet here it is, reaching you, as if it's been waiting all this time to be spoken aloud. Imagine a family portrait, sepia-toned and stiff, taken in the late 1800s. Parents seated, children standing upright beside them, faces pale, eyes glassy. But what if one of those figures, who looked so very alive, wasn't alive at all? What if the children in that photograph were being raised not just under the watchful eye of their parents, but under the influence, the presence, of someone long buried, someone who should have stayed in the grave? Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. The family in question lived in a quiet American township where everyone seemed to know everyone, and yet nobody knew the truth. On paper, their household looked normal enough, but the neighbors whispered about strange candlelight flickering in the windows at midnight, of the children seen wandering outside barefoot, mumbling in broken voices, as if repeating words that didn't belong to them. There were stories of an old trunk in the basement, a trunk that no one dared open after nightfall, because the sound of knocking, soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, seemed to come from inside. What tied these fragments together was a single figure, a relative who had died years before the children were born. And yet, by every chilling account, this person never left the house. They didn't just haunt the family, they raised the children. What does it mean to be raised by the dead? Is it superstition gone too far? Or did these children grow under the shadow of something no human could explain? Over the next 7 parts, we will unearth how this secret twisted through generations, leaving scars that no one dared admit. But first, ask yourself, would you know if someone in your bloodline was raised by the dead? Or would you be just another descendant, carrying whispers in your veins, never realizing the truth that shaped you? The first strange record we uncover lies in the family's death certificate archives. It showed that the relative in question, an older woman named Margaret, was officially buried in 872. She had been declared deceased, mourned, and interred in the family plot by the old churchyard. By all accounts, her chapter should have ended there. And yet, within a decade, reports surfaced describing her presence inside the family home. Children who should not have known her spoke of Aunt Margaret as though she tucked them in at night, whispered lullabies, and punished them when they misbehaved. Their accounts were chillingly consistent. One boy described how she smelled faintly of earth and roses. Another child recalled her hands, ice cold, but gentle, combing through his hair as he tried to sleep. These stories were brushed off as childish imagination, but they grew harder to dismiss when townsfolk began reporting sights of a woman inside the house. They claimed she wore the same black dress she had been buried in, always by the window, never blinking, never speaking, as though watching for something the living could not see. And though neighbors insisted she had been long dead, the children inside grew up believing she was the one guiding them, not their parents. In fact, some whispered that their mother and father seemed powerless against her, like shadows themselves, moving only when Margaret allowed them to. What unsettled the community most were the photographs. Family portraits taken years after Margaret's supposed death still showed her, never in the center, but always at the edges, blurred and faint, as though caught halfway between this world and the next. And in each one, the children leaned slightly toward her, even when they were too young to have known who she was. The town tried to bury this truth, to laugh it off as trick photography or hysteria. But the photograph remained. The children grew, carrying with them the imprint of a hand that should have long ago turned to dust. And the question that lingered was one no one dared speak aloud. Were these children truly being raised by their living parents, or by the dead woman who refused to leave them? The testimonies of the children only grew darker with time. By adolescence, they no longer spoke of Aunt Margaret as a gentle caretaker. Instead, their recollections carried the weight of discipline, rituals, rules, and strange lessons passed down from someone who, officially, no longer existed. One of the daughters, interviewed much later in life, described how Margaret taught them to sit in perfect silence for hours in the basement, their backs straight, their hands folded neatly. If one fidgeted, she said, the punishment was swift, a whisper at the ear that froze the blood, followed by a sharp pain, though no one could ever prove how it was delivered. Another child remembered being awakened in the dead of night and led outside barefoot, forced to stand by the family graves as Margaret recited words in a language they didn't understand. The parents, strangely, never interfered. It was as if they too were under her influence, complicit in keeping the children bound to her will. Neighbors later claimed they rarely saw the children during daylight hours. The curtains of the house were always drawn. On the rare occasions when one of the children wandered outside, they appeared pale, hollow-eyed, and oddly quiet, as though afraid to speak too freely. Some even said the children's mannerisms resembled Margaret more than their living parents. The way they held their hands, the tilt of their heads, the unblinking stares. The most unsettling discovery came when researchers reviewed the parish records. Notes from a local priest detailed that the children often confessed to sins that weren't their own. Strange acts of violence, memories of the grave, recollections of Margaret's life before her death. It was as if she had implanted her memories inside them, merging her identity with theirs. One chilling entry, dated 1894, reads, "The girl speaks as though she were Margaret herself. She remembers a wedding, a dress, a burial. I fear she is not herself, but an echo." Whispers began to spread in town. Were these children being shaped by the dead, their very souls tethered to a woman who had refused to let go of her role? Or worse, were they becoming her, piece by piece, their childhoods consumed by the shadow of someone who should have remained in the earth? As the children grew into their teenage years, the influence of Margaret only deepened. What began as whispers in the dark transformed into voices that commanded, ordered, and shaped their every action. Teachers at the small rural school noted strange behaviors. The siblings spoke in unison, often finishing each other's sentences with an eerie precision. Their handwriting, despite being taught separately, looked almost identical. More disturbing still, their essays and journals contained passages describing events decades before they were born. Margaret's memories of family quarrels, illnesses, even the details of her funeral. When questioned, the children seemed bewildered, insisting these recollections were their own. One boy, barely 15, reportedly wept when asked about his childhood home, describing a farmhouse that had burned down before he was even alive. A girl spoke at length about a marriage proposal Margaret had once rejected, her voice breaking with guilt, as though she herself had turned down the man. The local community whispered a chilling question. Were these children living their own lives at all, or had they become vessels for someone else's unfinished story? Rumors spread that the family had locked away mirrors in the house. A former maid claimed she once saw one of the children staring into a cracked glass shard, whispering, "It's not me, it's her." The maid was dismissed the following week, her wages left unpaid, her warnings ignored. By this point, the parents had grown visibly frail, as though drained of vitality. Their neighbors described them as shadows of themselves, pale, withdrawn, and reluctant to speak. Many suspected they no longer held authority in their own home, that Margaret, though long dead, had somehow seized control. She was raising the children, shaping their futures, and perhaps even feeding on the parents' dwindling strength. One chilling account from a traveling salesman described his single night stay at the house. He claimed he heard muffled voices through the floorboards, dozens of them, though there were only 4 children in the home. He left at dawn, refusing to ever return. His final words to the innkeeper in town were whispered, "That house isn't Al-Ga, but it isn't dead either." And still, the parish records note, the children carried on. They never rebelled, never spoke against Margaret. It was as though her death had simply shifted her form, from body to shadow, from memory to presence, until she was indistinguishable from the lives she consumed. By the time the eldest child reached adulthood, the family had already acquired a reputation that the town could no longer ignore. People whispered that the children rarely left the house except under the cover of night. When they did appear, their behavior unsettled even the most hardened townsfolk. They walked in pairs, heads slightly tilted as though listening to an invisible speaker between them. Some said they muttered Margaret's prayers under their breath, archaic verses long fallen out of use, prayers no priest had spoken since the turn of the century. But the true horror lay not in their odd behavior, but in the strange incidents that followed them wherever they went. Crops in nearby fields withered in unusual patterns, as though scorched from beneath the soil. Livestock refused to cross the family's path, pulling violently at reins until blood streaked their hides. A farmer's wife swore she saw the eldest daughter standing outside her window at 3 a.m, eyes blank, lips moving without sound, before vanishing into the fog. Inside the home, the atmosphere grew heavier, and visitors described it as suffocating. A neighbor invited for supper once claimed that the meal tasted of soil and iron, and that throughout the evening, the family never once addressed each other by their given names. Instead, they all whispered the same one, Margaret. She seemed to be the only presence that mattered. It was as though the children had been erased, their identities folded into hers, until they were no longer individuals at all, but fragments of a single, long-dead will. What disturbed investigators decades later was a series of journals discovered in the attic after the house was abandoned. They were written in identical handwriting, though signed by different children. Each journal entry began with the phrase, "She woke me today." The writing described Margaret as orders, what to wear, where to walk, when to speak, when to remain silent. Some entries hinted at punishments for disobedience, punishments not inflicted by the parents, but by Margaret herself. How a dead woman carried out such punishment remains an unanswered question, but the fear in those words is undeniable. It was in these journals that the first chilling suggestion appeared, that perhaps Margaret had never died at all. The funeral, some speculated, may have been staged, or worse, that she had found a way to outlive her body, embedding her essence into the lives of those who had no choice but to carry her forward. The years dragged on, and the family's isolation deepened. By now, the surviving children were no longer merely odd. They were feared. The village had tried to intervene, but each attempt ended in failure, swallowed by a sense of dread that made even the bravest turn away. Local clergy whispered that the family was cursed, though they never dared to perform exorcisms. "Something old lives in that house," one priest was recorded as saying before abandoning his post and fleeing town entirely. What unsettled historians most was the persistence of Margaret's influence across generations. The children who had been raised under her dead hand eventually had children of their own, and witnesses claimed those infants bore the same distant, hollow gaze, as though the chain of control had passed directly into their eyes. Neighbors described lullabies sung through the open windows of the farmhouse, soft but toneless, always the same 4 lines, repeated endlessly, night after night. No one could recall the words, but everyone who heard them confessed to sleepless nights afterward, plagued by visions of soil cracking open and hands reaching from beneath. Town records uncovered a shocking detail. At least 3 times in the span of 2 decades, the family filed no official death certificates for members who simply disappeared. Rumors spread that the children who strayed or resisted Margaret's rule were not buried but consumed, spiritually, perhaps physically, absorbed into her presence, leaving no remains. Whether this was metaphor or truth, no outsider ever confirmed. By the late 1800s, the family home had become a place of pilgrimage for the curious, though none stayed long. A writer from New York attempted to document the story but abandoned his project after a single night, stating in his unfinished notes, "At midnight, the children stood at the foot of my bed. Their mouths did not move, yet I heard Margaret's voice from them all. She asked me to stay forever. I fled before dawn." Even after the house was abandoned, visitors swore they heard laughter echoing through the walls, the sound of small feet scurrying across floors that should have been empty. And always, in the silence after, a woman's breath, low and steady, lingering in the ear as if pressing against the very soul. The last documented chapter of this haunting saga came not from family records, but from the town's collective memory. Stories whispered in kitchens, traded in barns, muttered on porches when strangers passed by. It is said that when the final generation of children left the farmhouse, the building itself resisted. Doors refused to stay open, shutters slammed. Though the air was still, and those who stepped inside felt as if hands gripped their ankles, urging them to stay. But eventually the bloodline thinned, and the descendants scattered into anonymity. The house, silent at last, began to rot into the soil, and yet Margaret's name never faded. In old diaries, she was always referred to not as a relative, not as a ghost, but as the one who would not leave. Historians now argue whether she truly died at all, or if she somehow lingered between worlds, binding herself through ritual, grief, or madness. The question is not whether the children were raised by her. It is how. Were they groomed in silence to become vessels for something greater than themselves? Were they molded into guardians of an unnatural pact? Or were they simply broken by generations of whispered terror until they believed they belonged to her forever? Travelers who come upon the ruins of the farmhouse still report strange sensations. Some hear weeping in the cellar. Others smell iron and soil, as if the ground itself is raw. A few, those brave or foolish enough to sleep within its walls, swear they wake to the sound of a woman humming from inside the earth below, her lullaby vibrating through the floorboards, threading into their bones. No words, only sound, but enough to convince them that someone else is still there. The town refuses to restore the property. They say it's not theirs to fix, not theirs to touch. They call it Margaret's ground. Families warn children not to go near, yet every few decades, someone disappears near the ruins, and whispers return. That the children never really escaped, that Margaret never really released them, and that somewhere in the hollow of that farmhouse basement, her eyes are still open,